and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, we continue to examine President Trump's Middle Eastern tour and assess its impact on the region and ask, what's President Trump going to be bringing home with him? Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump arrived in the United Arab Emirates this morning on what is the final leg of his Gulf tour. Well, it's a tour that's included his historic visit to Saudi Arabia and a stop in Qatar. Well, in Saudi Arabia, he was warmly received by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, with both leaders focusing on strengthening cooperation in the fields of defence, energy, technology and space. Well, during the visit to Riyadh, President Trump also announced plans to lift sanctions on Syria. And whilst he was in Qatar, the White House said that President Trump and Qatar's Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, has signed deals expected to generate some $1.2 trillion in economic exchange. Well, for more, I'm joined here in the studio by Taufiq Rahim, who is a geopolitical strategist and the biographer of a new book on President Trump's second term. It is entitled Trump 2.5, A Primer. So we're going to be talking about this book with Taufiq and plenty more. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. I just wanted to start by asking you about the investment forum in Riyadh, because you were there. And I just want to ask you, first of all, I mean, what you found most striking about the forum, and perhaps give us a sense of the mood in the room.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was quite a remarkable forum. I'm sure it seemed that way from afar, but definitely inside the venue, it was even more so. It wasn't just the personalities that were there. It was the energy in the room. It was very reminiscent of the 2017 so-called Davos in the desert. This forum was nicknamed MAGA in the desert, and it had that feel, especially when Trump came on and he was there being serenaded by the Lee Greenwood song, and then ending his speech with the YMCA song, with His Highness Mohammed bin Salman joining him on stage. So there's a very festive, convivial atmosphere, and I think a lot of renewed optimism about what this relationship could mean, but also the new potential direction that President Trump outlined in his speech.
What do you think is going to stand out as the years go by as being the sort of the great photo moment of that visit to Riyadh?
I think just the image of President Trump on that stage with those two big flags behind him, having almost this intimate conversation with the Crown Prince during the speech, where he's asking him, do you sleep? While having this massive audience out there. I think that's what's going to be iconic. The sound bites, we'll see what has staying power. We might be kind of coming back to them later on.
We've been talking about this visit all week here on Al Arabiya News. One of the quotes that stood out for me, a senior vice president for strategic and international studies by the name of John Alterman said, "This region is President Trump's happy place." Now, as someone who's been a biographer of President Trump and who was in that room, I was just wondering why you think the Middle East is so appealing to President Trump, and if indeed you agree that it is his happy place.
Definitely, he has a lot of familiarity, especially from the first term to today, and then the business links that he's developed. But I think he's, comfortable in many settings, and this is definitely one of them. But it's also, in some ways, a difficult one because he's charting a new course, and we saw that, let's say, further afield with regards to Israel, which some people would have said is a happy place. So I think he's not afraid of being bold in any environment. What's been interesting has been that the reception to his boldness has been quite high here. And I think that's what made the difference on this trip.
And in terms of perspective, I mean, I was thinking about it myself in terms of parallels between President Trump and how he does business. And he uses his family in a lot of his business enterprises as sort of ambassadors for the Trump brand, and they're quite involved in his working life. And that's something you'd find quite a lot in Middle Eastern companies. I mean, do you think that sort of family dimension is a thread that he finds quite easy to identify with?
Yeah, I mean, I think he, in a way, is ushering in this era of the personalization of geopolitics. And this region, just given, like you said, the rulers, their families, their own personal touch and their leadership, it resonates very much with that moment. And I think it's a moment that's defining not just the Gulf, not just President Trump, but also kind of the world and international relations writ large. This is the direction we're heading into.
We're going to be diving into this book in a moment.
Sure.
I just want to stay with Riyadh for a little bit
Please.
longer, though, and ask you whether this knowledge of the Middle East and this experience of the Middle East is something that's new to President Trump, or whether it's something that, you know, looking through your book, which starts in Queens in New York, where President Trump grew up, whether there was some exposure to the Middle East at a sort of an early stage in his life.
Well, he had exposure in two ways to the Middle East early on. One was it's really how he formed a lot of his formative political opinions, because he rose in his real estate career and business career right after the OPEC oil boycott and the inflation crisis of the 1970s. And so he had a lot of perspectives about how to deal with the Middle East, with Gulf leaders, etc. He was also very much close to the 9/11 attacks and the response to that in terms of rebuilding New York. So in that sense, politically, that affected him. And then, of course, a lot of the tenets of his towers, particularly Trump Tower, also came from this region in the 1980s. So he's been very familiar with figures in and out of the various Gulf countries and, of course, Saudi Arabia for quite some time.
So fast forward to the year 2025. I mean, having just arrived from Saudi Arabia, what would you say the state of relations is between the US and Saudi right now?
I think it's extremely strong. And I think what shouldn't be underestimated is the evolution from 2017 to 2025, not just on President Trump's side, but also in the region and the leadership here. If you look at the Crown Prince and where things were in 2017 to today, he's very much taking a pro-peace stand in the region, trying to create reconciliation. You see the outreach to Iran, you see the settling of the conflict in Yemen. And in that way, both Trump and the Crown Prince and other leaders are meeting each other in the same place to drive forward in the region rather than look backward. And that was reflected in President Trump's speech, as well as the response from the Crown Prince, who applauded those remarks very strongly.
Earlier in the week, we spoke to a Saudi academic, and I asked him what sort of things people got wrong when dealing with Saudi Arabia in the past.
Right.
And he said, you know, we don't like to be treated like an ATM. We don't like to be patronized or lectured, preached to. Do you think President Trump is getting it right when he pitches the tone when he's talking to people in Saudi Arabia?
I think yes, but also at the same time, he's exerting American power and demonstrating that America is really where the world goes for capital, for a marketplace, and for military support. And in that way, I think there's a lot of respect. He will not be afraid to say something that maybe ruffles feathers, but there's a respect that comes kind of with what President Trump is doing. Because a lot of the businessmen that did accompany him still did ask for large funds, coming from Saudi Arabia. And I think that is going to be a challenge to unpack. How do you deal with that perception? Because, of course, the Saudi plan for towards 2030, the Vision 2030, is unlocked a lot of funds for different projects. So that, I think, is a continuing challenge.
Let's talk about your book, as we promised we would.
Sure.
One of the things this book says is the inauguration of President Trump on the 20th of January 2025 ushered in a new era. That era is, of course, now unfolding.
Right.
How do you think it's going so far?
Well, I think it's unfolding in a very rapid fashion. Ultimately, it's not just about the moves that the Trump administration is making in terms of disrupting really a global order that people were used to, but then the second and third order effects of that. And that's why, I label it a new era, and in fact, a new American era as a dominant player kind of in this age. But it's very much about the response to that. And for a lot of countries who've been used to kind of an American architecture, even if it wasn't working, so to speak, we can see what's happening in Gaza. But ultimately, countries all over the world, but also in this region, have to define how they reassert their sovereignty, how they actually show up with their own power in a world where America is receding from being the envelope around each country, and facilitating their kind of defense, etc. And so I think that era is now unfolding. And I think the Gulf in many ways is ahead of the equation compared to others.
Why the title of your book? Trump 2.5, and then the word a primer as in a textbook or as the base layer of a coat of paint?
Yeah, I think so. Starting from the second part of that, I think in a world where there's so much vitriol, there's just outrage or partisanship or taking a side, a primer is meant to be this overview, giving people a dispassionate way to engage with what is one of the most important phenomena of our time, which is the rise of Trump, the rise of this new movement in the United States, and the unlocking of a new era. And why Trump 2.5? I think, people have been looking at the return of Trump and saying Trump 2.0. It's this, second coming, it's the second term, and they underestimate actually what happened in the intervening period, which is he went through all these trials and tribulations. He had to consolidate his team under pressure, and they've had 4 years to plan and also cohere their principles and philosophy. So Trump 2.5 is kind of a level beyond. It's something more than just 2.0. They're very prepared, they're very agile, and they're very able, and that's what we're seeing unfold very quickly early on in this administration.
And lessons learned, presumably, from the first administration. How different is this second administration?
Well, in the first administration, he did not know Washington, D.C., and there was very much a Republican administration, at least in terms of the cabinet. They were not all his choices. They were not all people deeply integrated in the MAGA movement, and so there was tremendous turnover. Today, even when there was, let's say, a scandal in terms of Signalgate, Mike Waltz was shuffled to the nomination as an ambassador to the United Nations. And otherwise, the cabinet has remained intact, has been extremely loyal, extremely disciplined, and exercising very much in lockstep the agenda of Trump 2.5 and what he ran on.
So very different in many of those respects from first administration.
And they're very competent in many respects. I mean, these are some of the most established individuals in the United States. You look at Treasury Secretary Bessent. This is a very serious individual, and not taking the administration seriously is to the peril of opponents and others who may be, looking to criticize or ridicule because of the style of the president. But his administration should not be underestimated.
Okay, it's been 115 days since the inauguration. What would you say have been the biggest achievements, or what's been the biggest achievement of that time?
I think very much is the exercise of executive control. Obviously, you could point to a particular case, such as the border, where he's completely turned that situation around 180, whether that's been at the detriment of certain rights or certain process. He's completely reduced the illegal, migration flows. However, I think the signature achievement of the administration has been exercising executive control over the bureaucracy, over policy making, and ensuring that his writ is carried out. I think it remains to be seen geopolitically on a lot of files where they've opened conversations. Can they close them? Can they make long-term arrangements? And I think that's what they're trying to do in this next 100 days, and we'll see if that's possible.
And as you were saying just a moment ago, the reason for the title of your book, well, part of it was just the speed at which this administration is proceeding. I mean, is that something that's taken you as much by surprise as everyone else, do you think?
So to be honest, no. I was following this very closely, and I attended the Madison Square Garden rally, and you saw kind of the lineup of people who are around him, the type of supporters he has, the consistency of the agenda. They were ready. They were prepared. I think what's surprising is the boldness that he's willing to take early on, including with Iran, for example. And we haven't yet seen what his move is going to be on North Korea, or what the final deal with Russia and China is going to be. But I think because he's moving quickly, he's willing to make much more drastic moves early on that reshape the entire way nations around the world interact. And that, I guess, is a little bit surprising.
And he's got these allies. I mean, someone like Elon Musk at his side. How valuable is that, do you think, to
Oh, I think it's tremendously valuable. And Elon Musk, for all of his random tweets, is a very central figure in the United States, including, or maybe especially due to SpaceX. And so he's never going to be persona non grata amongst the defense establishment and others because he's an invaluable fixture. And so it's not just he's the world's wealthiest man and individual with all of these assets. He's an indispensable one to the American establishment, which some might say is opposed to Trump. And because of that, they're very much a formidable duo.
And there were people on the 20th of January, and we spoke to some of them, who were afraid of a second Trump presidency. They were worried about it. Should people be afraid of any aspects of this presidency? Are those fears in any way justified?
I think it depends on where you're looking. Look, politically, for sure, he's asserting his agenda, and he's reshaping the nature of American politics, and in some ways, the way the world works, irreversibly. So if you fear for that future, or if you feel that it does not align with your political perspective, I think there's very much reason to fear, because he is a formidable figure. That being said, I think people project a lot of things. For example, the plane from Qatar, or a third term. They look into the future and they start prognosticating on fears that really may never materialize. And I think in that way, people live in an imagined future rather than the reality of the present.
And when President Trump says something like, I might run for a third term, or he goes off script, says something perhaps that takes everyone by surprise, is it really a surprise? Is it really him being spontaneous, or do you think there's a bit of careful strategizing that's taken place before he says such a thing? Well,
he's a very intuitive figure, also intuitive in terms of his media engagement, etc. So he sees what resonates and then doubles down. So and that's not in terms of garnering support only. That's also when he sees a reaction that comes from his opponents. So when he said, he might run for a third term, or is being speculated on, he saw the consternation that caused the kerfuffle, the noise. And as he's learned from his time at The Apprentice or in other settings, the more noise there is, the better it is for him, because he dominates the news agenda. And so sometimes it's difficult to discern fact from fiction. And sometimes his fiction actually becomes fact because it takes a life of its own.
So do you think the third term thing was a joke, or do you think there is an element of truth in perhaps exploring what avenues exist?
I think it is a joke, and he went and said that in one of the television interviews in the United States, that he's not going to be seeking a third term. However, if there was a movement that, let's say, said, we want him to run a third term and we want to create a constitutional amendment, I don't think he would back away from that. He would let it play its course. And, 80 years ago, it was permissible for the President of the United States to run for a third term. So that's not necessarily organic to the Constitution in its early days.
In your book, you say President Donald J. Trump is one of the most powerful figures in modern history. Do correct me if I've misquoted you in any way there. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I had an even more dramatic quote, which the editor rolled back, which was that he's perhaps the most powerful person in the history of humanity. And if you look at the American project being one of the most potent political forces, if not the most expansive political force in the history of human civilization, in terms of its reach, in terms of its control, in terms of the number of people under, let's say the American architecture, and he's now exercising personal leadership over the American project, I think it's hard to argue with the fact that he is so singularly powerful.
And just turning to your book again, I mean, I can see here, chapter 2, The Man, the Myth, and MAGA. I mean, it begins by sort of, it looks back at Donald Trump's formative years.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what stood out in those years in Donald Trump's childhood that made him the formidable man that he is today?
I think definitely him being this outsider in Queens. I mean, you'd hate to get into the psychological profiling, but I think there always is this Gatsby-esque, aspect of Trump, where he then wants to come to Manhattan and be recognized there. And you see him constantly go back to the newspapers on record that he criticizes as fake news, or the same Wall Street executives that he kind of in some ways lambasts. he actually also seeks a little bit of their agreement, if not approval, in what he's doing to show that he made it. And I think the Madison Square Garden rally was kind of in line with that. I think the other aspect that gets overlooked is his older brother who died from a bout of alcoholism.
Fred Jr.
Yeah. And, ultimately, Donald, Trump is a very disciplined individual. And he's someone who has tremendous stamina well into his late 70s. And that doesn't come from, just, randomly. This is a person who works very hard. And I think that with his persona is missed, but it comes from his parents and the discipline they instilled.
It comes from Dad. I mean, Fred Trump Sr. was extremely strict.
And his mom was a disciplinarian, yeah.
Did he have a very strict childhood?
I mean, I can't always speak to everything because I haven't interviewed the man himself, but he had a very disciplined childhood and a disciplined household. And I think there were a lot of expectations set.
It was Napoleon who said that to understand a man, you have to understand what was happening in the world when he turned 20. Now, in President Donald Trump's case, that would have been June 1966 when he was at Wharton studying economics. I mean, the space race was going on. The Cold War was in full swing. There was Beatlemania. What do you think it was about where President Trump was when he was 20? So anything in the sort of the late 60s that stands out for you as being something that really shaped him?
I think that's a very insightful kind of quote and then apply to his life. I think it's that period of the late 60s into the early 70s where you see this tremendous optimism, this moonshot. You start with John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy ushering this optimism. You're looking at the end of this 20-year boom after World War II. And so America's become this great jewel in the world. Everybody's looking to it. And then you hit with the Vietnam War, you hit with the oil crisis, you hit with inflation. And you start to see this America that might be falling apart and other countries rising to get almost as wealthy, like Japan. And I think that affected how he sees things, that he said, wait, America's not reaching its potential, and it's an own goal. And we were about the moonshot, and where did that go? And it's almost 40 years he's been looking for that restoration of that moment from his 20s, and now he feels he has his chance. And I think he's going to try for it. I think he's going to try for a moonshot, a Mars shot of his own to, be aligned with the moonshot of the past.
Right, so some of the early lessons in life in his childhood, his early lessons in real estate,
yes,
I mean, clearly shaped him tremendously, as we've been saying. I mean, what aspects of the Donald Trump real estate mogul that he became in the late 70s, early 80s, do we see in President Trump?
Well, I think it's what you see in the 80s as well as what you saw in the 90s. So in the 80s, when he realized I can be this insurgent, developer and define a style, and then actually everybody will move towards it, which is what happened in the 80s. The 80s kind of moved towards the Trump style and this rise of kind of wealth and this real presence of buildings and luxury. And he ushered that in iconically, that many things became Trumpish. And then in the 90s, he went through a bout where he was really on the ropes, and he came back. And so, he was at quite a negative in terms of net worth. And somehow he pulled a Houdini, a financial Houdini, so to speak, and, came back. And so I think when he, lost in 2020, and was out of power, I think he understood what it meant to be on the ropes, and when people counted you, down and out, and come back.
And he's used what's around him to the maximum effect, hasn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's ridden the crest of the social media wave. He rode the crest of the reality TV wave, and he can communicate. Do you think the fact that he can communicate as successfully as he does, that in a way that resonates with a number of people that resonates with, is that his most impressive attribute, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a media theorist, Marshall McLuhan, who says the medium is the message. And I think, and that was coined, there in the 60s. And so Trump kind of rode that media rise that, as you pointed to, went to social media. And he understood that the medium itself is what is the message. Just being ubiquitous, being in all the forums, being the man in which the messaging all revolves around. I think that's, something he realized, internalized, and embodies very much so.
Has he reshaped the presidency forever, do you think?
I think, the United States has had a lot of phases and a lot of, important presidents all the way, obviously back from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but, to Andrew Jackson and Teddy Roosevelt and obviously FDR, you could argue John F. Kennedy even in a short amount of time, Ronald Reagan. I think there are a lot of transformative presidents, but I think given the moment that we're in, it's the combination of the changing world and the changing nature of America, and within America, the nature of the presidency that makes him truly and uniquely transformational.
Yeah, and the change of the party system and how the Republican Party has really been the vehicle for President Trump's political movement, which looks like it's going to live on after he's gone. But just my last question to you, because we'd sort of speculated about this idea of a third term, and we've sort of decided perhaps that's, a headline-grabbing technique. But in terms of actual succession planning, what do you see as being the most likely course of action in the next presidential election in the United States? Who will be on the ballot, at least for the GOP?
Yeah, I mean, obviously on the Democratic side, you have, AOC, and you have Bernie rising again, and a few others, Pete Buttigieg and so forth, Gavin Newsom. On the GOP side, even Trump has alluded to both Marco Rubio, who's obviously been kind of an ascendant figure in this early part of the administration, and J.D. Vance as being potential successors. And then you have his kids who've been kind of high profile. But to be honest, there's only one Donald J. Trump. There might be a junior, but there's only one President Donald J. Trump. And he is a singular figure. Sorry?
There's a Baron.
I think, there could be down the road somebody, but I think I don't think anybody's going to live up to who he is, whether that's positive or negative. And many people may try, but I think he has no successor.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Taufiq, Rahim, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We can cross now to Washington and speak to Dr. Jacob Olidort, who's a former advisor to the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, now the director of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Dr. Olidort. A real pleasure to have you. We've been talking all week about President Trump's regional tour of the Middle East. I'd just like to start by asking you, what's really stood out for you in terms of what's come out of this visit?
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, first and foremost, it's no surprise that Saudi Arabia is the first host of the visit. It is the center of not only regional, but geopolitical events, obviously hosting one of the Russia-Ukraine talks early on. But this visit, of course, has been nonstop successes. We're already, I think, on day 4 of his visit. It is billed as an opportunity to deepen commercial and cultural ties between the United States and this very important region. And we have seen that expressed in hundreds of billion-dollar investments into the United States from Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, the $1.2 trillion investment from Qatar yesterday. And then probably the big event as well is the meeting between the president and Syria's interim leader, Ahmed al-Shara, brokered by the Saudi Crown Prince yesterday, and with the Turkish president being there on video. That, of course, recognizing a new chapter in that part of the world, and the need as well, as President Trump urged Ahmed al-Shara to normalize ties with Israel, build the conditions for peace, and cooperate on defeating terrorists together. So all very exciting, very new developments, and I think the start of a very welcomed new chapter in an important region.
Sure, you mentioned lots of points there. Notably, this was a visit that was about business deals. It was also a visit with serious geopolitical repercussions. What do you think the standout, sort of iconic photo moments are going to be looking back on this?
Yes. It'll be a number of things that come to mind. Not only, of course, that handshake and the photo between with the president, the Saudi crown prince, and Ahmed al-Shara, but also, of course, the McDonald's truck there, obviously welcoming the president's video as well in the streets of Damascus, and the cheers for a new future there and hope that the United States brings. And of course, the many protocol moments, the welcoming of the president by the Saudi crown prince and other dignitaries. So a lot of good moments, a lot of happy and positive aspirations for the region, for our people, and for the people of the Middle East.
Right, and the Middle East chosen as the region that President Trump visited for the first planned state visit of his second term, and of course Saudi Arabia being the first stop of that visit. What does that say, do you think?
Well, I think it reflects the reality of our world today and the very important role of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as not just a regional player and a center of gravity, but also one for all of global issues. And that is exactly right. And it's a part of that as well that you saw that arms transfer as well by the United States to Saudi Arabia in recognition of the need to bolster our common deterrence and our common efforts together to address not only mutual opportunities, as this trip demonstrates, but also to against the mutual threats that we face together.
Why do you think Saudi Arabia is such a crucial ally to the United States?
Well, this is obviously goes back decades as part of our history. You have, of course, since the middle of the 20th century, you have American families who have brought up children, obviously as part of Aramco and that chapter in opening up the modern relations between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is an enduring partnership. It is one based on deep trust and deep engagement between our two peoples. And as I mentioned earlier, the increasing awareness of our shared hopes and our shared priorities for the region and the world. And of course, the moment everybody is looking towards is Saudi Arabia being the broker for this next chapter of peace in a region that in the last 2 years has been beset by the worst kind of strife and war. And so it is in that spirit, I think, as well, that the president visits the region, again, with Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, as his first stop.
Yeah, and of course it was the first place President Trump visited at the beginning of his first term as well, outside the United States. But I'm just thinking, casting our minds back 8 years to that first visit of the first Trump presidency, how much do you think the balance of power in this region has shifted in the interim?
Well, it's a fundamentally different region today, and that's not a controversial statement, than it was in 2017. Today, we have, but I think amid the dangers of the last 2 years, we have new opportunities to make history. And that begins, of course, with the current state of the Iranian regime, which is the weakest it's been in its 5 decades at the helm. Today, it has lost virtually all of its proxies across the region. It is vulnerable on the inside, not only the stability of the regime, but also, as the Israeli military has demonstrated, it can strike anywhere at any time. And then, of course, we're on the cusp of this groundbreaking negotiation between the United States and Iran for the dismantlement of its nuclear program. So I think that is probably the key difference and the key also kernel of where hope begins now for a region of peace and stability.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been extraordinary to be in Iran watching what was happening in Riyadh, where you saw the prosperity of the nation, the enormous infrastructural projects that are underway, and many of them at a late stage of completion, and the president of the United States there heaping praise on the leadership. I mean, I wonder if all of that sort of in a way sent a message to Iran to say, perhaps in a parallel universe, you might get a welcome of that nature, or you could have prosperity of that kind at some point in the future.
Very much. Parallel and potential future. Obviously, that is part of President Trump's key points when he talks about reaching a deal with the Iranian regime, that the Iranian people deserve a better future for themselves. But as you pointed out correctly, this trip, and it shouldn't be understated at all, is the envy of the Iranian regime, of Russia, of China, who are watching the United States broker opportunities for peace, for mutual prosperity, with certainly players that they would very much like to see themselves in partnership with. And so it is exactly the right posture, and we'll follow it closely.
Okay, so that's Iran, slightly excluded from, totally excluded from this visit. Another interesting exclusion from the itinerary was, of course, Israel. I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps there's a message in the decision not to stop off in Israel on this trip. What are your thoughts?
I don't read anything into that. Of course, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu was the first foreign dignitary to visit the White House since President Trump came to office this year. And he has visited twice for official state visits. And there is, my understanding, very close coordination between our two governments. So I don't think the relations have ever been closer, in fact. So I don't read anything beyond the scheduling.
Would you expect to see an expansion of the Abraham Accords in the months ahead?
I very much would. I think that would probably be the next priority after once a deal with the Iranians is completed, or in parallel.
What do you think the support of the Abraham Accords has meant for the countries that have already signed up for them? Because it's been quite conflictual for some of the signatories, given what's been happening in Gaza in the last few years. I mean, do you think it's dented the Abraham Accords in any way, or perhaps made some of the signatories feel, some sense of they've embarked on something risky for them, at least as far as their domestic audience is concerned?
No, I very much, I don't read it in that manner. I think that the Abraham Accords have actually been a bulwark for peace and stability over the course of the last 2 years in particular. You've seen that with the coordination between our partners in Israel in taking down Iranian ballistic missiles. You've also seen it behind the scenes. Again, there, Saudi Arabia has been a key broker in the early months after October 7th of mitigating more maximalist moves against the state of Israel by other actors in the region. And that is because of the strong foundation established by the Abraham Accords. The reason they hadn't progressed previously over the last couple of years is because it hadn't been a priority for the Biden team up until August of 2023, when they realized they would not get the deal that they had hoped for with the Iranian regime. Of course, by then it was a little too late, as the Hamas attack occurred just 3 months later, aimed at stalling those talks. So I think it's only a matter of time before they resume. And of course, it is the flagship foreign policy achievement of the first term of the Trump administration. So I have no doubt this is the top priority looking forward.
You mentioned President Biden, and we're now 115 days into the second Trump presidency. How do you think the perception of the United States has changed in the Middle East compared to where it was, say, 116 days ago when President Trump was in office? When President Biden was in office, I should say.
It's a different world. It's a completely different reality and world. And of course, President Trump returns to the White House with a very strong record of making history established during his first term. So no surprise, of course, that it was such a warm welcome. It is also no surprise as well, given his effective leadership on the world stage, that we have the release of American hostages around the world, including on Monday, just before he landed in Saudi Arabia, the final living American hostage released from Gaza. And I think that comes from a deeper appreciation by our partners in the region that this is a president who understands who our friends are, who understands the importance of standing together with our friends, especially in their time of need, and seizing on opportunities together, and for taking the right, strong approach to deter our adversaries and prevent their attacks and their threats. And these are exactly opposite from Biden's inaction, weakness, not just on behalf of our partners, but on behalf of the American people. And you saw that with about 200 attacks on U.S. troops in the Middle East over the last 4 years, which had maybe half a dozen U.S. responses attacking empty warehouses, basically. So that it could not be more different today.
I mean, just looking at the potential for, foreign policy success stories during this second Trump administration. I mean, a lot of them are in the Middle East, aren't they? I mean, when you think about what's happening in Gaza, you think about the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran's nuclear ambitions. I mean, there's some real potential for ticking off a list of historic concerns and security issues in this region. How do you rate President Trump's chances of entirely ticking every item off that list?
Yeah, I have every confidence that he will tick off every measure and establish new opportunities in a very short time right now. You're absolutely correct that this is a region of importance. It has always been a very important region, not just for its own stability, but also for world affairs. And nobody appreciates that more than President Trump. Again, as we've seen during his first term and as we're seeing today during this important visit.
And just circling back to Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, and you mentioned this at the beginning, was the host nation for bilaterals between the United States and Russia right at the beginning of the second Trump presidency. I mean, clearly Saudi Arabia is going to be a key partner in that effort by the United States to fix some of these historic problems.
That's right, and we'll see what future role it continues to play. Obviously, it was noteworthy, as I mentioned, that it brokered, I believe it was the first round of these talks between Russia and Ukraine. But I think that goes to the point, and of course, Turkey may be hosting one today as well. That is not incidental to the nature of that conflict, which has, again, trans-regional ties. Obviously, the Iranian regime supplying technology, drones, and weapons to Russia to abet its invasion of Ukraine. And so, I believe that these opportunities, but also obviously conflicts, cannot be viewed narrowly from their regional lenses, but must be taken as global phenomena.
And just lastly, Dr. Olidort, what would you say is, the impact of this regional tour by President Trump on the Middle East?
I think, so everything I mentioned in terms of the achievements is monumental for our prosperity as well as that of our partners. But I think there is something as well about the tone and the symbolism of this visit. What President Trump has done and has initiated by visiting this part of the world in this manner with these achievements is signaling this does not need to be a region of strife, of conflict, of war. This is a region of prosperity, of peace, of opportunities for the well-being of its people, of all people, of the American people. And I think that is probably one of the most historic changes that we're already seeing, just him being in the region today. And I'm very excited to see how that materializes in the tangible achievements we're seeing come out of this trip.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Dr. Jacob Olidort.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Well, let's get more now, and we can speak to Angie Wong to tell us more about President Trump's historic visit to the Middle East, and in particular to Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much indeed, Angie, for joining us. Today is, of course, a Thursday. Great checking in with you to sort of take a look back at the week that has passed. You're a Republican committee member in Florida. Angie, of course, the first thing we'd like to start talking about is that visit to the Middle East by President Trump. What was the big headline, would you say, when it comes to the coverage of that visit?
I think President Trump has had a very, very successful first overseas visit of his presidency, his second term of his presidency. He's achieved a lot of things in a very short period of time, including basically bringing de-escalation to a region that has been in war conflict for many, many years. He's managed to do it through business deals over diplomacy. So I think he's found a different way. He's been making deals left and right. He's invited a lot of American business leaders to join him on this trip, and they've come back with incredible deals. They all wanted to be wheeling and dealing with President Trump and with American companies. He's also signaling that this is going to be a very business-focused administration and that he's ready to play with the Middle East and he wants to make deals. And I think through that, he'll be able to strengthen our relations with the Middle East, as well as have long-term goals business-wise. And he's really positioning America in a very strategic way that we can work together.
And how's it been covered where you are in the United States? Has the overall feeling across the board been favorable when it comes to the coverage of this visit?
Yeah, I mean, look, the visuals are great. He is certainly bringing back real U.S. leadership onto the world stage. We are seeing a very, very strong president, a president who is making deals left and right on behalf of companies like Boeing and Amazon. And even Elon Musk joined him for part of the trip. So I think he is very, very proud of what he's done. Now we're also hearing word that the U.S. is close to reaching a deal, a nuclear agreement with Iran. And that's just coming in very little bits and pieces of that has been coming in the last hour. Trump has expressed a lot of optimism over the negotiations after sending a letter back in March asking to have talks on this. So I think we might be getting an announcement pretty soon on this.
And you say that the coverage has been overwhelmingly pretty positive there in the US. I'm assuming it does vary slightly from news outlet to news outlet. And you know, one of the stories that sort of perhaps wouldn't go away this last few days, in some outlets at any rate, was the gift of that Boeing 747 palace in the sky, some people have called it, worth 400 million US dollars. That's been a slightly less welcome headline, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, we certainly have some media covering on that. And many people think that is a Trojan horse. There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's our favorite expression here in the US. And the last time an American president accepted a free ride from a foreign government, I believe, was President George W.H. Bush. And there were reports back then that there were some aircraft failures while he was on flight, and Secret Service was scrambling to make sure that the U.S. president was safe. So, you know, those stories kind of drum up a big question mark in President Trump receiving a free aircraft. Now, he says it's just temporary while Air Force One is getting refurbished. I really think that this was all just part of the business dealings. This is what happens in the business world here. It sweetens the deal. This was given to him right before a big, big trip overseas, his first ever to the Middle East. And I think that it is going to, you know, it basically sets the tone for President Trump's visit. And I think it was a very welcoming visit from all parties.
There were some on the sort of on the right-hand side of the political spectrum that would be, let's say, typically more favorable to the president, that weren't too happy about this gift. I mean, fair to say some people in President Trump's own sort of orbit were a little uneasy about it.
Many people were very uneasy because it actually goes against some of our laws here to accept such large gifts as an elected official. And, you know, I don't know if President Trump at this point really cares. This is how he's used to dealing in the business world. Whether or not he is ultimately going to ride on this plane is a big question mark. You know, President Trump has been doing a lot of baiting, especially to the press, just to get them focused on some issue like this while he actually gets the job done in the background. Look, I mean, he's made incredible deals with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the UAE, and he's coming back with trillions of dollars for American companies and American workers. So I think that is what the media should be focusing on rather than accepting a gift. Although, yeah, they can focus on that, but ultimately, I don't know if that's going to matter in the long run when we are doing lots of business with the Middle East.
So when it comes to what President Trump is bringing home with him, you mentioned there some big deals have been inked during these last few days. I mean, are people now expecting that to translate into a sort of an uptick and a bit of a boost for the US economy?
I would like to think so. I mean, remember, a lot of these deals usually take years to negotiate. He's been able to do it on one trip, and we're still within the first 100+ days of his administration. Amazon Web Services is going to be investing in Saudi Arabia for $5 billion. You have AI joint ventures happening left and right, and you have Boeing receiving a placement rather, of 210 Boeing jets going to Qatar. So all of these things really do mean American jobs. Americans are going to be working. We're going to be benefiting here on the ground, while at the same time, we're doing trade deals. I mean, this is what Trump is all about. So let him do what he's very, very good at, which is the art of the deal.
So just to sort of sum up the Middle East tour that the president is now wrapping up, what do you think is going to stand out? And we've been asking this question to a lot of our contributors and guests the last few days, but what's going to stand out for you as perhaps being one of the most sort of iconic photographic moments of this trip?
Oh, wow. I mean, look, him being in all his glory in these beautiful palaces. There was one image that just came out today that has, I don't know what this actually means culturally, but there was he had just landed in the UAE, and there was a row of women with very long black hair swinging their hair around as he is walking down the runway. I'm not sure what that means, but I thought that was beautiful. It was a beautiful imagery. The one thing that does stand out to me that I think a lot of media is not reporting is that on President Trump's first official overseas trip to the Middle East, Israel is not on the itinerary. And I find that to be kind of strange because Bibi Netanyahu and Trump have been lifelong friends. And there's been a lot of reports since this weekend about a rift between Bibi Netanyahu and Trump, so much so that our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had canceled his trip. So we're not sure what that's about, but clearly Donald Trump has put up something on his Truth Social saying that he feels betrayed and that there was some disrespect there. But clearly now when he's there in the Middle East and skipping Israel, that's a big one for the US. Usually that's always on the agenda. And this time it looks like Israel might have been sidelined.
Yeah, is that something that we've been obviously asking our guests about that and asking, you know, is this a bit of a snub? Is this being seen as a snub by Israel? I mean, is this a story that the US media has got its teeth into as well?
No, I haven't seen too much in the US media about this. I just noticed it because, I get to talk to great networks like yours and other overseas networks, and I think that is a big one. I mean, we are very good friends with Israel. So for him not to include Israel on this trip and not to see Bibi Netanyahu, as we're talking diplomacy, as we're talking about de-escalation in the region, as we're talking about multiple trillion-dollar business deals, to not include Israel in that strategic planning and positioning of U.S. and Middle East relations going forward. We're talking decades going forward with these deals. It's more than a snub. It's a real big question mark in my mind as to what role Israel will be playing in the Trump administration.
Okay, Angie, let's move on to another story that's making some headlines there in the US as well. Right at the beginning of the second Trump presidency, an executive order was signed with the goal of limiting or doing away with birthright citizenship, which is, it's in the Constitution. I think it's the 14th Amendment that gives the right, gives citizenship to someone who's born on US soil. Where are we with the progress to kind of maybe have a rethink on what the Constitution says?
Right. The 14th Amendment never intended to automatically just give away birthright citizenship to any child born in the US. It certainly excludes children of illegal aliens. That's why there is a quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And in Trump's view, this was meant to exclude those who are here unlawfully. Now, we have a lot of activist judges who've let that one go, and it's never truly been challenged in the courts, and that has yet to be ruled directly. So I think this is going to be a fight over the next couple of years during the Trump administration as to what that actually means. Does that mean that if you arrive here, overstay your visa, and have a child, are you then just automatically an American citizen? And by extension, the entire extended family becomes American citizens? That has been what's been abused and used as a back channel to become American citizen for multiple decades. And for the first time ever, President Trump is going to be challenging this rule and really getting some clear definition of what the 14th Amendment actually means.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, generates discussion all over the world, because there is a perception that if you fly to the United States and give birth there, you're sort of giving your child this passport and this opportunity in life. And I'm just wondering what the American public thinks of this debate. I mean, do you get the impression people are with the president on this in thinking that perhaps there needs to be a rethink?
I think many Americans are now feeling the effect where multiple foreign nationals have taken advantage of this law. And because it's never really been tested in the courts, more and more people do it. In fact, there are industries here in the United States that offer pregnancy vacations where you can give birth to a child and then the entire extended family comes over. There's a clear pathway to doing this. It's been abused, it's not lawful, and it's time that we actually put some speed bumps to it. I don't think that's going away entirely. I think that there are going to be plenty of foreigners coming here and giving birth to American children, but if it's done lawfully. I think that is what we're just trying to do here. I think many Americans support just enforcing the laws that are in the books and not having these kind of backdoor loopholes that many, many people have been abusing for far too long.
Okay, so this is going to be weighed up by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, as we know, has got a 6-3 conservative majority. I mean, is that what it boils down to? Is this a conservative, liberal, left-right issue, or is that too simplistic an interpretation of it?
Well, I think ultimately the Supreme Court is just going to look at the laws on the books and enforce the laws in the books themselves. They're not trying to rewrite anything. There's really nothing other than to interpret what's there. And back to the point of the 14th Amendment having subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Ultimately, it is left to the courts to decide on a case-by-case basis if this child born here is an American or not. And if the parents had entered illegally, that's a big question mark. And it's going to be left to the courts to decide. The Supreme Court, as much as we like to see the left, right, and everything, I think they're pretty straightforward to just sticking to what has already been in the laws and interpreting the Constitution.
Okay, so which way you see this heading, Angie?
I don't know, actually. This is a bit of a nail biter for a lot of people, only because it's become the norm, because it's never been challenged in the U.S. courts. And I don't know if the norm has kind of just entered into our psyche as, well, that's just what happens. I would like to see a stop to some of the pregnancy holidays that people do take to enter this country. I get it. America is still the place to be. People still want to be here. And if this is one way of coming in, great. I prefer for everyone to come in here using the legal routes. I think that's going to be beneficial to everybody involved. And President Trump has actually made an announcement for other ways of coming into the country legally. So I think that is going to be something that I don't think it's a left-right issue. It's just come here the right way.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Angie Wong, a Republican committee member in Florida. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at the week's most exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.